That was a doozy. All right, check this shit out. Boom. Think that will work. You guys see that brewing sake at home thing?
Ew.
Nice.
Look at that technology.
Very fancy.
Yeah, I'm trying. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls, all brewing related, but it's the first time I've ever had to present like a thing. I'm just going to show this to you guys, but afterwards I will just email it to Doug so you guys can all have it.
Perfect.
Cool. Are we waiting for anybody else, or you think this is it?
Somebody might pop on, but I'm not. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
The core is here.
Huh?
The core is here.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. I'm drinking Perfect Snow, which is a 21% ABV Nigori. Doug had it last week, I think.
Yeah, it's good.
And drinking it on the rocks. So a couple giant ice cubes in there. You can tell it's fairly unfiltered. It's actually got chunks of rice in it. So that's a real doozy.
I've got the small bottle.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Yep. The cans will be fresher because they're newer. Yep.
At least Paul had it in the fridge.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Paul's, I started selling sake at a Reliable Market. They didn't have any sake in the fridge at all.
What?
My sake was required to be in the fridge because it was local. One of the styles was unpasteurized. And then after mine sold like hotcakes in the fridge, he just started putting more and more sake in the fridge.
Oh, really?
Smart guy, you know? Cool. So you guys can still see this screen, right?
Yep.
Let's see how I advance the slides. Maybe I just click on it. Oh, hey, look at that. How do I go back? All right. I got it. 2 screens. So yeah, anyways, it's good to talk to you guys. I know a lot of you have tried to brew sake. I made this PowerPoint today, so I kind of laid out like a pretty basic way to make sake, but it's also going to teach you the sort of foundations on how to make your own recipe or, you know, that kind of thing. So you can go forward and make different kinds of sake or experiment with sake. But this is a great place to start. I didn't do anything about growing your own koji. In the beginning, I totally recommend to people that they just buy koji. Obviously, growing your own koji is like a pretty important step in commercial brewing. It's the most important step in brewing sake, but it's a whole science unto itself. So if you buy sushi rice, like already milled sushi rice, and you buy store-bought koji and White Labs No. 9 yeast, you can make a really delicious sake. So it's a great place to start. And we'll start you guys there. But the koji thing is like, I could give like a 25-hour class on grow koji. So, and there's a lot of information out there about how to grow koji, like in a cooler and on home scale. That's not really the best thing for me because I grow 150 to 200 kilos of koji at a time. All right, so brewing sake at home. Boom, you can still see the screen, right? Duct tape and all.
Yeah, we got it.
Cool. Yeah, I wanted to start off by, there are some challenges depending on what level of home brewer you are. Challenge 1 is temperature control. So sake is a cold and slow fermentation. The best way to describe the sake yeast and fermentation process to beer makers, which I often do, is you're doing 2 things. You're malting and fermenting in the same tank at the same time, right? That's number 1. And then sake yeast, like real sake yeast, is basically the flip side of a Belgian yeast strain. So the colder you keep it and the kind of low and slow, that way you get amazing complexity and fruitiness and spiciness and flowery kind of notes and all kinds of stuff. If you go fast and hot, you get nothing. You get ethanol, That's about it. So no flavor at all if you go fast and hot. So it's kind of the flip side of a Belgian yeast strain, which is pretty interesting. Right now, and I say this later on, but I'm going to say it about 100 times. Right now, the only yeast I would recommend that you use, unless you want to try to get some sort of special yeast through not regular channels, is White Labs number 9. It is WLP 709. I think I put that in the thing. Their number 7 is like mesquite smoked Band-Aids. So if that's your thing, use number 7. But number 9 is like watermelon, strawberry, bubblegum, Jolly Rancher kind of. It's really interesting and it's delicious. The number 7 has drifted quite far from the original number 7. And then Y yeast sake strains are the same thing. They've just drifted very far from the original samples. I don't know anything about Omega or any other yeast banks. I don't use them. All my private strains are held at White Labs. And so Omega might offer homebrew yeast, but I'm not sure. But number 9 is what you want to use for all of your sake in the beginning. Later on, who knows? Maybe I'll bring enough yeast back from Japan that I can start my own sake yeast bank. So open fermentation, it's definitely open fermentation. I don't recommend using an airlock with a tight lid and a tiny little 1/2-inch tube or 1/4-inch tube or whatever. There's way too much fermentation and way too much CO2 being produced. I wouldn't put an airlock or a tube going into a thing of water. I would just loosely put a lid on it or some sort of fabric lid. Run a little bit of elastic around a piece of fabric and stretch it over there like a hairnet, something like that. But don't bother like sealing it all up. And then ingredient sourcing. So you guys are going to buy your own koji. There's a couple different places you can do that. And then you're going to buy basically sushi rice is probably the best thing you have. And you can make delicious sake doing it. It's, later on, you've got to get like real serious into it if you're going to try to get like actual high-end sake brewing rice or make your own koji, that kind of thing. So, but there's going to be a little bit of variability in ingredient sourcing. So if you guys get like a weird yeast strain or something, that might have a little bit of variability to it that I don't have to deal with. But those are kind of your chief challenges, I think. We're going to go into this. Oh, water. I'm not sure how many of you filtering your water or using bottled water or whatever. The water can be hard water. It just has to have 0 iron. Japan has a really unique geology because it's volcanic. And so it's got these like just dozens of layers of sand and rocks and sediment, volcanic ash and stuff, and it's a perfect filter. So Japan has this water that's like hard water, but it has 0 iron. It's pretty unique. And so most brewers, to be able to approach anything close to that, will filter their water out completely, reverse osmosis and charcoal, and then add minerals back to your water. So if you have some just town water that's low iron, you're fine. And you can try that first. And then if you want to use distilled water or you want to filter your own water using a water filter, even one from Home Depot does amazing work. And then I put in some basic amounts of salts that you'd want to add to play around with. These are the 4 that I used on a commercial level. So gypsum, everybody has. Sea salts, monopotassium phosphate, and Epsom salts I bought on Amazon. So they're not hard to get. Gypsum is calcium sulfate, so you'll get a lot of calcium. Sea salt, obviously, sodium. And then monopotassium phosphate is like phosphorus and phosphates. And then Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, so you'll get like magnesium. So it creates a nice hard water. But that's if anybody wants to go real deep on brewing water. But I would just
Are these listed as grams per gallon or grams per 5 gallon?
That's going to be grams per kind of the batch size we're more than likely talking about. the calculations are real weird and difficult, so I just put in some general amounts. Is there anybody on this call who's making more than a barrel of sake? Nope. All right, then we're fine. If you're making less than a barrel, those amounts are perfect. So you can play around with those. But kind of over a barrel, then we got to start talking about upping the amounts of stuff in this recipe. But those amounts are great. They'll make real hard water, real hard minerally water. And then minerals are great in sake because they do two things. They allow a lot of mouthfeel. And so you can up the mouthfeel of even a dry sake by using hard water. And then if your sake is coming out too acidic, small batches of sake tend to produce a lot more acid. So if they're coming out too acidic, you can harden the water up, and that will lower the overall acid on the final product. So, but I would just play around. I would, you can get a town water report from your town. It's online. And you can just make sure that your town water has low iron. That's all. And it should, because all of our water is treated in the Boston area. All right, cool. We're going to talk about crafting a recipe. This is going to get a little complicated. Not super complicated, but this is how everyone does it. Japanese brewers, there's 1,450 Japanese breweries. There are a whopping 18 breweries in North America. So we all make a batch the exact same way. So you got an open fermenter. This can be whatever size you want it to be. I'm going to warn anyone on this call right now, everything's metric from here on in. We do not use Fahrenheit or gallons or ounces or any of that. So
that's fine.
Yep. And you'll see the reason you use metric, even if you're like a non-Japanese brewer, is because it's super easy and it minimizes math mistakes, which can be pretty bad when you're making 2,000 liters of sake. So open fermenter, basically the koji rice, which means the koji already grown on the rice, not koji spores, but the koji already grown on the rice is going to be 20 to 25% of the recipe. And then rice obviously is the other 75 to 80% of basically your grain bill. And then water, I know this is gonna be really weird, is 140% of the grain bill. So the way you get to that is you take the volume of your fermenter in liters, and I mean right to the tippity top. You don't have to reserve any sort of working capacity or anything. So your volume of your fermenter is in liters. Typical homebrew bucket is like 25 liters, give or take. I did 30 liters because I suck at math. So let's call it 30 liters. So you have 30 liter bucket, which is just under 10 gallons, like 9 gallons. And you divide that by 3. So you're going to divide, did that get out of here? I'm sorry. Whoops. I'm sorry. That's the only part that kind of left, that disappeared in editing. But you can see in the example. I'll type it in here as we talk. So you take the volume of your fermenter in liters, divide it by 3, and that's your complete grain bill. So in the example down below, I've got a 30 liter fermenter. I divide it by 3. That's 10 kilograms. The one thing you have to remember about metric is 1 liter of water weighs exactly 1 kilogram. So liters and kilograms are completely interchangeable, which is awesome when you're writing a brewing recipe. So 30 liter fermenter divided by 3 gives you 10 kilograms. That's your total grain bill. And 20 to 25% of that will be koji, and 75 to 80% of that will be rice, steamed rice. And so the thing about the koji is, so a normal filtered commercial sake is about 20% koji, because they're trying to maximize output. The higher the koji, and I literally mean like 1 degree differences, 1% differences, the higher the koji, the more umami you're creating, which is a glutamic acid There is some umami in sake. It has more umami than any other alcoholic beverage. So you're creating a little more umami, like unctuousness, kind of, a little bit more earthiness. And so if you want a fruity, light sake, you kind of go to the 20% side. And if you want something like heavier and ricier and a little more like oomph to it, you go to the 25% side. It's a weird thing because less koji means more rice. So more sugar means more fermentation. So the koji's job is to convert the rice into sugar as you're brewing. And so if you're buying store-bought koji, you don't have to worry about the health of it. It's going to be a perfectly fine conversion. It's going to have enough enzymatic activity. So yeah, 20% is a good place to start if you're looking for a clear, fruity, delicious sake. And then if you're looking for something kind of heavy duty, go 25 or, you know, towards that end of the spectrum. And then the rice that we're talking about is just steamed rice. So you will wash the rice, soak it in water. I'm actually going to explain that to you. I didn't put a slide in there. I just realized, but I'll just explain it to you. It's not that hard. So for you guys, you lack a lot of the analysis equipment that I have in a brewery. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your rice that you buy. If you just buy like a really high, nice high-end sushi rice at someplace like Reliable Market, that'll make great sake. Most of it's grown in California. So it's a type of rice called calrose, which is not one type of rice. It's kind of a family of rices. And so calrose rice actually comes from Sake Brewing rice. There was a rice called omachi, which is a delicious Sake Brewing rice. And it was brought to California in the late 1800s. And they crossbred it with some other short grain rice. So calrose rice that comes out of California has sort of a sake rice parentage, but it's sort of high-end sushi rice. There's a bunch of other rices, koshi hikari or akita komachi. Like you'll see all these names. If you just buy really nice polished sushi rice in a giant bag from Reliable Market, you'll be totally fine making sake. So you're gonna wash the rice for a couple minutes in a colander with your hand just to get rid of the powder that's on the rice from milling. And then you're gonna soak the rice in water. And you're gonna soak the rice in water until the rice becomes white and opaque. That's the best way without going way down a rabbit hole. The best way to tell is just the rice is gonna go from being a semi-opaque grain where you can see the middle of it to a completely chalk white grain of rice. And when that happens, you're done soaking it. So you'll pull it out of the water, drain it, make sure you get as much water off as you can, and then you're gonna steam the rice. So you're not gonna boil the rice, you're gonna steam it. The best way that I steam stuff for this size batch is I literally use cloth that's like a bed sheet, like regular strength cloth, and I attach it to the top of my homebrew kettle. I have a 10-gallon homebrew kettle. I attach it to the top with a ratchet strap, like you'd tie something onto your car. And I leave enough slack where the rice can go inside there and doesn't come above the lip of the pot. And I put the lid on the pot and I boil water in the pot. That's it. So you've suspended the rice in a piece of fabric with a ratchet strap. So that's the best way I know how to do it. The problem with getting like a steamer, like a dumpling steamer or a food steamer is it's usually like sheet metal with holes punched in it, and there aren't that many holes. Like if you really measured every hole and measured all the metal, it's a lot of solid material and very little negative space. So a sheet, which is incredibly porous, strapped onto the top of a kettle with some bow to it so you can put all the rice in the kettle, would do a much better job than screen or any other thing you're going to buy. So that's all I do. And you steam it until it's done. It takes about an hour. You want to steam it for about an hour, hour and 20 minutes. And the rice will be cooked but still dry. That's about the best way to describe. I did not put this in there, but you could weigh the rice would be another way. If you want to get super nerdy, you can weigh the rice. And when it's done steaming, it should be 140% of the weight of the dried rice. So if you're steaming 10 kilograms, it's going to be 14 kilograms. That's the best way. Conveniently, 140% is also your water. So you don't have to worry about remembering that number. So, so you're just going to steam rice that way, and then you have to cool it down before you add it to the tank. So you're going to spread it out on a table or some sort of work surface that's clean and sterile. I use isopropyl alcohol. And you're going to cool it down. It doesn't have to be ice cold. It just has to be cold enough not to kill the yeast, which is, usually 75, 80 degrees. So you want to cool it down as far as possible. You got to also remember you're keeping your sake cold. So colder the better, but you don't want to like put it in the fridge or anything like that. Just leave it out on a counter to cool down. I use sheet plastic from Home Depot, spray with alcohol, put it on my counter, like spread it all over the whole counter, throw all the rice on there and break it up and just let it cool naturally. And so the recipe, you've got 20-25% koji, 75 to 80% rice. Water is 140% of your grain bill. It's weird to think about things bigger than 100%, but in this example, you've got a 10 kilo grain bill. So you're going to add 14 liters of water. So whatever liters of water you use times 1.4 is 140%. And so that's how you figure out your water. And luckily, you can weigh your water on a scale. You can just put the bucket on a scale and weigh it. Every liter weighs a kilogram exactly. So if you don't want to volumetrically measure it, it's much easier to weigh it, especially since you guys are going to be adding, 2 or 3 liters at a time. You could easily weigh 2 to 3 kilos of water. The other ingredients that are not koji, rice, and water are lactic acid. The batch size that we're talking about here, around 30 liters, 40 liter fermenter, 4 milliliters of lactic acid. It comes in a jug from the Homebrew store or Amazon. It's technically called 88% Homebrew, 88% food grade lactic acid. But I've never seen anything outside of that you could order. So I don't think you could order some weird lactic acid variant. You don't want to use anything else. Some of those like weird sake homebrew kits come with citric acid and malic acid, which is like a wine thing, or like a wine maker's acid blend or something. You don't want to use any of that. Only lactic acid. And then yeast. And then I reiterate yet again that number 9 yeast from White Labs is the best. All the other yeast are pretty wacky at this point. So number 9 is the way to go. So that's kind of how you write a general recipe.
Todd, do you know what pH you're kind of shooting for?
Sort of beer pH, believe it or not. 4.2, something like that. It's not sour. Sake is quite sweet, actually. But you're looking for like a normal beer pH.
Yeah, that's the finishing pH, right? Yep.
Yeah, so that's the finishing pH. You don't have to worry so much about the lactic acid creating a certain pH. You need some lactic acid in the beginning. There's some variability. But with this size batch, I mean, I assume we're all kind of talking about like a homebrew bucket-ish size.
Yeah, 20 liters, something like that. Probably.
Yeah, so if you're doing that, 4 milliliters of lactic is fine. Again, this would do a 30 liter, even a 40 liter fermenter. I probably wouldn't add much more than that. But as I got higher and higher, you'd add more. It's not an even progression, right? So the acid does a couple things. Brewing yeast is an acidic yeast. So the acid keeps out other microorganisms in the early days and allows your yeast, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is what sake yeast is too, allows that to really proliferate in an acidic environment, which it likes. It keeps out other crap that you don't want in there. The other thing is sake is very, very, very fruity. And so you need a bit of an acidic background to push those fruit flavors when it gets on your palate. And so they add a little bit of lactic acid in the beginning. Yeah. Originally, this is a modern way to make sake. Originally, they would actually do a 1-month yeast starter and grow their own lactic acid through lactobacillus fermentation. Super pain in the butt, but it makes a really cool kind of funkier sake. Not funky like a sour beer, but definitely funkier. It's got some little more wild character to it, which is pretty cool. And those are available commercially. They're usually kind of refined commercially, but yeah. So that's our recipe. Oh, now we can talk about brewing. Everybody can still see this, right? Building the batch. All right.
Yeah, we're good.
Huh?
Yeah, we're good. We can see it.
Awesome. Sorry. So yeah, building a batch of sake is kind of like building up a sourdough bread starter. So you're actually adding 25% of the ingredients. This is more of a commercial model. I know Doug and Mark and a couple of other people mentioned that I have a video on my old blog, bostonsake.com, right, about like a super simplified version of this, you know? This is more of a commercial thing, but you could still do this in a bucket. It's not hard, and it'll make a really delicious sake, and it will kind of ground you in the foundations of making sake, which is kind of cool, right? So basically on day 1, you're adding 25% of the rice and the koji in the water. So, and then you're skipping a day. Day 2, you don't have to do anything. You literally just don't do anything. It's the easiest thing ever. And then day 3, the other 25%. And now you're halfway there. And then day 4, you add 50% of your ingredient bill. The only other things that are outside of the ingredient bill that you add only on the first day is obviously you're going to add your yeast on the first day. You're not going to like trickle your yeast in here over multiple days. All the yeast goes in for a pretty like large homebrew bucket, like to make a carboy full of sake. I use 2 50 milliliter White Labs. I don't know what to call those. They used to be tubes back in the day, but now it's some kind of heat sealed plastic pouch thing.
Yeah,
but
they're the same size, but yeah.
Yeah. So 2 50 mil pitches. I just like to stack the deck. It's not too much yeast that you're going to get autolysis, but it's enough yeast where you can, make up for maybe some older yeast or something you might get from a homebrew store. So I use 2. And then 100% of the lactic acid. So all the lactic acid goes in on day 1, just to acidify the environment. So yeah, so day 1 you do that. So you would mix your koji and water together in the bucket, in a sterile bucket. I don't think we have to talk about how things become sterile. And then, mix your koji in your water and then wash and steam your rice. And just let the koji and water and lactic acid sit in there. And then add your steamed rice and stir it all together. It's going to look real stupid. It's literally a bunch of rice and water. And then you add your yeast last. So add the yeast in there, give it a quick stir, boom, done. Cover it, put it in the fridge or whatever. I'll show you. The next slide is all about temperature and time and days and everything. So, so that's what you're gonna do. You're gonna add all that stuff on day 1 and then wait a day. You don't have to stir it. You don't have to do anything. You just got to give it time to build up enzymes, give the yeast time to get ahead of steam. The koji will start converting the rice. You'll definitely get fermentation by the end of day 2. And then day 3, you do the exact same thing. So day 3, you add your water and your koji, stir it around. This will be the easiest time ever to stir it because it's high water content. And then you will wash and soak and steam your rice. And then when your rice is cool, you'll add it, give it a quick stir, put it back in the thing. And then the next day would be your heaviest day. So on a batch like, you guys are, this batch is 7 kilos. So, oh wait, was that what it was? Hold on. Yeah. So the batch that I'm doing now, which is a 30-liter container, you're only talking about steaming 3.5 kilos, which isn't really that much. When you're talking about strapping a piece of cloth across a homebrew, across a big boil kettle, 3.5 kilos of rice is not a lot. So you do the same thing on day 4. This is your heaviest day. You would add the koji in the water first. You'd stir, and then wash, soak, steam your rice, and add that. And then, one of the challenges that I wrote in the beginning was about temperature control. So you have to have temperature control. You cannot make good sake without a fridge on a temperature controller or some other technology to keep this thing pretty cold and vary the temp. So what I use is a 5 cubic foot chest freezer attached to a temperature controller, just like a Johnson temperature controller. And then I have a thermal well that goes inside the bucket into the sake. So the freezer comes on and off with the temperature of the sake, not the temperature of the air or whatever. So that's what I use. Hopefully most of you guys have a similar setup, fridge or a freezer or something like that. And you'll see on the next slide, you definitely have to use that. Oh, this tip on the corner here, I think I said that before, use only lactic acid and sake yeast. There's some of those sake homebrew kits that come with mead yeast and champagne yeast and all kinds of stuff. It's not going to taste like sake. It's going to taste like alcohol, but it's not going to taste like sake. And so that's basically the whole brewing process, but then the magic comes with this. So this is your brewing / temperature curve. And this is basically how you ferment every batch of sake on the planet. So day 1, the temperature when you're done brewing is going to be about 14 degrees C, which is not warm. So, but it's warm enough to, let the yeast get a little head of steam and the koji start to work. Day 2, it won't take much to lower the degree. And then day 3, you're going to drop it down to 6.5 C, which is pretty cold. There are some breweries in Japan that would use ice as a portion of the brewing water to drop it from 13 to 6.5 quickly. Since you're weighing your water out anyways, it's not hard to weigh out ice. So, which is the same thing. So you could, if you wanted to, add a little bit of ice in place of your brewing water to help you crash that. It's not going to kill the yeast or do anything. And that's day 3. And then day 4, which is your final brewing day, everything's going to stay relatively cold. And then you've got brew days on the left. Brew days on the left. And temperatures on the right. This is a fairly normal temperature curve for high grade sake. So you might see some other materials out in the world that say go to 15 C, and that is for sort of a commercial grade sake or like a table sake. I don't think that's really what you guys want to brew. So the colder and the longer, the better. So I tried to shorten up this graph a little bit by making some date ranges on the side instead of having like every single day. And so coming out of fermentation, you'll slowly warm it up. So obviously a fridge or a freezer is necessary for this. Days 8 or 9, you're about 9, 10. And then you have a couple of days where it's 10.5, 11. You have, 4 days where it's 12 degrees, and that's the peak of fermentation. I got a tip on the side there. You only really want to stir it like every 3 days. In the beginning, you're going to be like, what the hell did I do? So the rice is going to absorb a lot of the water, and it's just going to look like a bucket full of rice with no water in it. It's real scary the first time you do it. And so you're going to be like, oh shit, like, would this even become sake? It just looks like rice. And so what happens very quickly is the koji starts to break down the rice. And as the rice breaks down, all of that water it absorbed goes back. And then you're also making ethanol, which is thinner than water. So the whole thing becomes liquid very quickly. But the first couple of days after brewing, like days 5 and 6, it's just going to look like a rice cake in a bucket. It's a little weird. So don't worry about stirring it. Just stir it like every 3 days or Smaller batches require less frequent stirring than commercial batches. And so the apex of your fermentation is like 12 degrees centigrade, and then you're just going to slowly bring that down. 1 degree, then a little bit, and then 1 degree and a little bit. And the fermentation will kind of just round off and slow down. These numbers on the side, you don't have to go to 35 days. It depends on a lot of factors, water chemistry, yeast health, all that. You might not have to go that far, but definitely 24 to 28 days is going to be your normal fermentation range. And it is quite possible without much work and just waiting and going through these temperatures to get sake to 21%. I've actually gone to 23.5. Wasn't very good, but I went to 23.5 just to see what it could do. So you could easily go to 21 if you wanted to go that high. I like to stop it around 16 or 17 and leave some sweetness in there and some mouthfeel. But you could definitely go pretty dry, pretty high alcohol, and then water it back later, right? That's up to you guys. You're going to have to see how much sugar's in it. Yeah.
But how are you taking your gravity readings? And when?
So, cue next slide. Thanks for the.
Okay.
Boom. You guys are really going to have a problem with lack of analysis equipment. So the problem with sake is, the problem from your point of view is you are creating sugar the whole time. So there is no starting gravity. So when you make beer, all the food is in the tank on day one. You can measure that and go, okay, our starting gravity is, 20 bricks or whatever, like you can go, it's 15 Plato and 15 Plato with this particular yeast strain means about this alcohol. You cannot do that with sake. So the only way that professional brewers can track sake is you need equipment that measures ABV like on the fly. So I use a digital ebullimeter, which is about $5.5 grand. And then twice a year, I double check my stuff at Sam Adams at the brewery in JP on their, $85,000 Anton Par gizmo. And so that's kind of how I keep my stuff going. But you're making sure the koji is making sugar the whole time. So it is entirely possible to have the alcohol go up and up and up and up and up, and the bricks to say exactly the same, right? So your alcohol is going up. You're at like 14% alcohol and the bricks is like 11. And then you're at 16% alcohol and your bricks is like 11 because you're just making sugar the whole time. So there is no starting gravity. And so you guys are, so usually what I measure in a brewery is ABV on the fly. And then I measure acid, which is a little Japanese gizmo that I buy on Amazon for $600. And it literally just measures the acid, and it's a very specific acid type. It's not like a wine acid. It's not like a titration kit or anything like that. So that's pretty hard to do for somebody like you. And then I measure gravity, certainly with Japanese hydrometers, but you could totally measure gravity with a regular hydrometer. But again, you could increase the alcohol and the hydrometer won't move. So it doesn't really have the same tracking capabilities that you might have with a beer fermentation. You could certainly say this thing is this gravity, which is great. And that would be nice at the very end, after your thing is clarified and whatever. But during fermentation, it has no meaning whatsoever. Sorry. So for home brewers, it's kind of like, I don't know. What I would do is scoop out some sake and put it, you'll know when it gets closer. The other thing you also can't do is like how many bubbles are coming out of an airlock or whatever. Like none of that crap works because you're making sugar the whole time. So what I would do is when it gets pretty liquidy and it's just like, it looks like sake with rice bits floating around it, I'd probably press it. And then it's all by taste at that point. It's all by taste and kind of knowing when to stop it, when you like it, when it tastes good. That's really all that matters. And so that's a big challenge for you guys. And then the processing thing, if you don't want to drink this all the time, right? You're going to need a little bit of equipment to process the sake down the road. So sake is pretty interesting. You're digesting the rice over time and fermenting those resulting sugars. So you basically end up with like rice dust in it, and some of that is microscopic. So it can look clear to the naked eye, and you taste it and it's chalky. All that has to be filtered out to be the best way. Oh, so that's another big challenge for you guys.
Hey, Todd,
Yeah.
do you go down to like a 0.2 micron filter, or do you go higher?
Commercially, I go 0.4,
Okay.
which is sterile. Anything under half micron is sterile. I do that.
Okay.
But about 5 microns is fine. So if you buy a mini jet or a super jet or something, which is the little like small wine filters, I think it's like the only company that makes them. Their coarse filtration pads are fine. It's 5 micron nominal. And so that would be totally fine. You don't need to go coarse, polish, sterile. You could. It's interesting to do, certainly. But 5 micron, the coarse pads, it comes out real nice. Yeah. And so you're also going to have to fine it with bentonite. I wouldn't use any other kind of fining. But before we talk about that, you have a finished batch of sake. And now you have delicious sake, and all of the crap you put in the bucket are still in there. So the big question is, how do I get the sake out from all the rice bits and koji and yeast and all that shit? So there's actually a pretty cool post on my old blog. I just put a link in here for you guys. I basically make a small version of a sake press out of plastic bins. So big food grade plastic bin, another food grade plastic bin inside it with holes drilled in it, and then a slightly smaller bin that fits inside the top bin that you can fill with water and ice and weight down the sake. And so what you'll do is you'll have to create some kind of fabric bag. So you'll create a bag made of fabric or canvas or whatever, and then you'll clean those and fill them with sake mash and fold them and put them inside the press. The video is pretty self-explanatory. And then you put the smaller bin on top and fill it with water, and you get like 80, 90 pounds of weight. And that just, over about 24-hour period, it'll just press all your sake out. And it will come out into a carboy. It'll still look white, but it'll be pressed. So you'll see how much stuff is left behind. Normally, it'll be about a 60-40 split. So you'll get 60% sake and 40% solids. The solids are called kasu, K-A-S-U. And if you go online, you can go on a 6-month rabbit hole about how to use kasu. You can pickle vegetables in it. You can cure meats in it. You can make ice cream with it, and breads and cakes and whatever. It's actually one of the most sought after ingredients for high-end cosmetics. So you can actually take kasu and mix it with a little bit of glycerin and mineral water and make like a face pack that will give you incredibly youthful skin. There's a high-end cosmetic called SK2 from a Japanese cosmetic maker. It's like a 1-ounce jar is like 200 and something bucks.
It's Korean.
Oh, is it? So there's SK2, there's a knockoff that's Korean. The original SK2 was made by Shinsedo in Japan, and SK stands for Sake Kasu. So,
Oh, I thought it standed for Sungyeong.
no, so SK2 is a brand from Japan, and Sake Kasu is what the SK stands for, because in the 60s, Shinsedo was looking for a way to find sort of Japanese folk remedies about nice skin and trying to translate those into products. And they started talking to people in the sake industry, and apparently it was common knowledge that everyone knew that people who worked at a sake brewery had really nice skin. And so the kasu, the stuff you all the physical material that's left behind when you press out sake has a lot of active enzymes and vitamins and all kinds of stuff, and it's really good for your skin. And so there's all kinds of recipes online about how to make face packs with kasu, and I don't know. I usually make food products with it because I don't care about my skin. So, yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with it. There's a lot of Japanese cooking. Fish cured in kasu is really delicious. So yeah. So anyways, that's what you're gonna get. So this, when you guys get around to getting this thing, I said I'll email it to Doug. You'll get this link to my old blog, and there's a great thing about how to make a press. You're gonna have to make some kind of press to press the stuff out. And so this is the easiest way. It's real cheap to do, and it doesn't take a lot of work, which is pretty nice.
What I wound up using is a hydraulic press like people would use for wine. And that actually, it comes out very clear. There's almost nothing to settle out at that point.
There's stuff in there, like you could filter out stuff, but yeah, it comes out pretty clear if you put it in some kind of hydraulic press for wine. I've seen presses made out of a ridiculous array of things. A lot of people in Japan who have small breweries will have a stainless steel box, and they'll buy a car press and a car jack rather, and flip it upside down on top of the press so it presses straight down onto a lid. And they'll use like a hydraulic press that way. This is just a weighted press called a fune, which is the same character for boat because it's just a giant hollow thing that they press out sake in. So that's the easiest way to press stuff out. But
I think there's at least a couple members of our club who have presses for cider making. And I guess in that case, we just need to add a bag.
Yeah, the biggest problem that I would have with that is a lot of those are made out of wood. And I wouldn't want to put my sake through wood that's just absorbed cider over God knows how many batches. You know what I mean? Like that's not, if you had a press that you only use for sake, that would be different. But I don't know. This is just food grade plastic. It's non-reactive. I'd be worried about an old like wine press or an old cider press that has a lot of stuff in it, in the wood itself. So, but yeah, you could try it. I mean, if it's super old, then I guess it's pretty impervious, and the stuff's only in there for 24 hours. It's not like a barrel. But yeah, I'd be a little careful with stuff like that. But there are small wine presses that are metal. They're just like a perforated metal cylinder. Those work too. But this would be a way for you guys to make, I mean, I use this kind of press making a half barrel keg full of sake, which is how I make sake at home. So if I make it at home, I make it in a cut-off keg vat. So 15 gallons or whatever that ends up being. So this is big enough that you could expand to that range too, which is pretty cool. But you'll see when you watch the video. So Nigori sake, which I'm drinking right now, is called unfiltered sake, but selectively filtered might be a better term. So if you want to make super creamy, delicious, interesting, unfiltered sake, I think you want to take the chunks of rice out of it. And so I use 1,000 micron stainless steel bucket filter from Utah Biodiesel. And I put a link in there to that. But some real kind of window screen size thing just to take the big chunks out is kind of nice and improves drinkability quite a bit. So even if you're just going to make unfiltered sake and not go through any of the clarification, putting it through 1,000 microns will just take out like chunks of rice, which is more pleasant and easier to drink, and makes it a little more delicious on the palate, which is kind of nice. So I recommend that thoroughly. When you go to Utah Biodiesel, you'll see they get a lot of products. When I started using them in 2014, they had no brewing products. It was like a biodiesel filter company. They make stainless steel mesh filters that fit inside a plastic homebrew bucket for filtering out biodiesel crap. And I ordered them because they were stainless steel and I could CIP them and it worked. And now they have brewing crap on there and cold brew coffee stuff and everything. So I'm glad that they, you know, they saw me using them and was like, oh, maybe there's a market, and now there's a huge market. Pretty fun. But yeah, something like that would work. A colander, like a mesh colander or something would work. Would just take out the chunks, which would be nice.
Hey, Todd, so when you're pressing off the lees,
Yeah.
are you worried about are you just like dribbling it into something and right through?
Yeah, I am. In that video, you'll see my whole setup, right? I
Okay.
open the bins. There's a you know, the plastic spigot that comes on like a bottling bucket or whatever?
Yeah.
That's in the bottom bin. And it just comes out of that. And I have it into a piece of tubing, into a carboy. And then there's saran wrap wrapped around the carboy, so you're closing off the top. You'd be surprised how much saran wrap and tinfoil we use in a professional brewery, but it works. There's some, I think the last slide talks about it, but nitrogen. You all have to buy a tank of nitrogen. No CO2 used in sake making. You'll really taste it like right away if you use CO2 to gas things or push things on draft. You'll taste the CO2 right away. It's pretty unpleasant unless you're making a sparkling sake. And so 100% nitrogen. You can get a small nitrogen tank from whatever gas place you get CO2 at. But you definitely don't want to use CO2 to blanket stuff or whatever. So the fune thing is pretty interesting. So it's a, you know, giant tub or, you know, bin or whatever. The sake is down in that, and the sake technically is still fermenting. So that whole thing fills up with CO2 real quick. And so you don't have to worry about oxidation or anything. You just load the bags in there and put the thing on and start pressing it. And the whole fune fills up with CO2 the whole time. It's pretty interesting.
There's an interesting picture in one of the books I have of an old style fune, which is, think of about a boxcar size, 3 sides of a boxcar with bags of sake and a tree trunk across it, and a large team of men and huge boulders pulling it down.
Yeah, there's a couple of breweries. There's 2 breweries in North America who still use that. I don't know why you would, but anyways, they use it. It's a cantilevered fune, so you've got the giant, long, low kind of thing full of sake, and then you have a huge tree trunk, basically, that's offset. So, you know, here's the fune, and the tree trunk goes way out like that. The guy in Oakland, California that uses it has 2 50-gallon stainless steel drums attached to the end of it by chains, and then he can fill the drums with water to provide weight on the cantilevered arm. And then there's a guy in Granville Island in Vancouver, and he has like a metal frame attached to the end of his cantilevered arm that he slots in weight plates from a gym. So he just like takes them and slots them in these little slots, and it just weighs it more and more and more, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, old funes are all made out of wood. It's just like a giant wooden boat, and you fill it with bins, and there's all kinds of different methods on how to push them. I actually went to one brewery where they still use rocks to weigh down the sake. It's basically a PR stunt at this point, but they had a wooden fune, and they had all these rocks that looked to be zillion years old and been handled a million times and washed and everything. And they just started stacking them on the thing, and it just weighed it down more and more. So they do small batches like that, which is pretty funny. Yeah, for your size batches, water and ice, because the ice keeps the sake cold, which is kind of nice. So water and ice is pretty heavy. I had a 10 in that video. I have a 10-gallon or 12-gallon bin. I put 10 gallons of water in, so that's over 80 pounds. So it's adequate pressure to press that sake, certainly.
Yeah, the wine press I use takes about 45 minutes. I use cheesecloth bags. I tried a couple of different textures.
Yep.
And a fairly fine one texture, but it's strong. It has to be strong. but a 40 or 50 psi standard house pressure water is enough. It's
on the wine press that has an inflatable bladder in the middle.
Yeah.
Those will do it. And you know what? So you said 45 minutes, but if you had left that under pressure overnight, you would get more sake.
I tried for 3 or 4 hours and I didn't get much. The result, I'm actually very pleased. The result, even fining it and so on, there's very little even catching it on filters and fining.
Sure.
There was almost no debris left.
Oh, wow.
I think it's because the cake itself acted as a filter.
Yeah.
It's sticky.
You're pushing it to the outside of the cylinder. And the cake itself is acting as a filter. Yeah, that's another way to do it too.
Yeah, I mean, it's not
at inflatable wine presses, but
it's not cheap, but it works really well.
Yeah, without a doubt, that's a good filter system. There was an early brewery in Texas Sake, which has changed hands, but that's how they started. Like commercially, they had a big wine filter, but exactly what you're talking about. It was just a cylinder, perforated metal cylinder, and it has an inflatable bladder in the middle. And they just used like house water to inflate it, and it worked. And they were selling sake that way. I had a fune at my last brewery. It's a ton of work at larger scale. But my next brewery and most modern breweries use a mash filter press, which is a hydraulic filter press. And so that's what we use. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but it's like hundreds of plates in a hydraulic kind of system. And so they just hang. And so every other plate is a filter plate, and then every other plate is a bladder plate that inflates with up to 120 psi of air. And so you clean the whole thing, and then you ram it closed with the hydraulics, and that holds it closed. And then you pump in the stuff, and when it stops flowing out under its own power, you inflate every other plate, and it pushes it against the every other plates of filter plates. So that's how I'll filter sake on a larger scale. I'm done with the fune, man. After a couple of years of emptying hundreds of bags of, it took me about 100 bags per batch at Dovetail Sake. So the bags were 33 by, so like a foot by 33 inches, which is pretty big. And so I'd about 100 per batch.
That's a lot of sake.
Yeah, it's a lot of sake. So I netted about 450 liters of sake, which is a batch for us, which is fairly small in the sake world, but one guy doing it was a lot. So, and then after I got my sake, I had to open up the fune and empty 100 bags of kasu, which was hundreds of kilos of kasu. So, yeah.
Does this stuff sediment out on its own? So as home brewers, we can just let time work for us and just let it sit around.
After pressing, there's some truth to that. You could, but the problem is there's still yeast in there, and you're going to get autolysis. So autolysis happens when yeast runs out of food, and then the yeast cells die, and their little bodies explode. And then all of those waste materials in the liquid, other yeast cells, which are starving, eat the bits of dead yeast bodies. And then that creates off flavors called autolysis. It's kind of like, some people say B vitamins, but other people say dog food. So take your descriptor. But it's not pleasant. And so that's the problem with just waiting and waiting and waiting for something to settle out. You don't want autolysis from all the yeast that's in there. So you need under 5 microns to filter out a yeast cell. And so if there's sediment in the bottom, there's yeast in the bottom. So you don't want to leave it hanging out for too long. The less sediment, the better, obviously. So the other problem is you're continually, even if you stop sake at 16, 17%, you're still fermenting. There's a lot of potential in there. And so if you just try to let that settle out, it'll just keep fermenting. And the koji will work way down into the low ranges. So you'd have to, I don't know, maybe -10 C, something like that. You'd have to go real cold, almost to freezing. But still, you'd lose a lot. Because you have to remember, without getting like boringly technical, you have to remember that a pile of rice is basically a pile of sticks. And so there's like tons of space in there, like negative space. And so you'd lose a lot of sake. You have to press it out. There's really no other way. You'll just lose a lot for your work, which kind of sucks. So, oh, and I talk about clarification. So bentonite is super cheap and super easy to use, and is the only fining agent that actually works on sake. Other fining agents don't really work that well. So you guys are going to benefit from some sick work, but I used to work at the Boston Beer Company, so I have a lot of beer industry contacts on a pretty high level. So I had a friend like a colleague that I worked with, who used to work at Gusmer Filtration. So when I started my sake brewery, I sent a 5-gallon keg of unfinished sake to Gusmer, and they did basically the same level of analysis that Budweiser gets on my sake for free. So I got this ridiculous, like 10-page PDF, highly scientific report. Basically, the gist of it is bentonite is the only thing that works. It takes out close to 90% of everything that's in there. So you just follow the directions on the bentonite package. You rehydrate it. It's clay. Doesn't really do anything. You rehydrate it. You mix it into your carboy of stuff that's after the press, and you shake the heck out of it, and then you put it in a fridge and you don't touch it. And it will drop way out. I do want to make sure that you guys understand that there's a lot of microscopic particles in there, which are also noted in this thing. So after you bentonite and fine it, it'll look super clear to the naked eye. It is not clear. Like, it looks clear, but when you taste it, it's a little chalky. And so that's what you can remove with a filter. So there's a little mini jet filter over here. This picture I stole from the internet. This is the mini jet, and then they have a sort of beefed up version called the super jet, which you could probably do 50 gallons of sake if you wanted to. It's like a Garagista wine filter. But this little mini jet I used for like 10 years, homebrewing sake. I also stole this other picture just to show you how much crap is in there. But that's somebody's homebrew sake experiment. That's post-pressing. So there's a fair amount of stuff. Depending on what fabric you use to make bags out of it and everything, there's going to be some variability to that. But there's a lot of stuff in there that you have to separate out. So you don't want to filter all that stuff, but you do want to drop that out and then filter off the top of that. You know what I mean?
I've been very lucky because I might get a 1/4 inch, and then I fine it, and admittedly I don't keep it very long. It gets drunk up pretty fast. I pasteurize it and it's gone. So the remaining yeast gets killed, and the enzymes get denatured.
Nice. So
that it's conditionally stable.
Right. Yeah, with homebrew sake, I never pasteurize it. I pasteurize sake in the brewery, some sake, but I never pasteurized homebrew sake. I never really felt like it was necessary. So but I had a filter. So I would filter, I'd probably filter down to the medium filtration plates, which are like 2 or 3 micron, and put it in a keg, and it would last 2-3 months easy, down to that level. So
yeah, I've had bad luck with filters, so I.
Oh yeah.
I went through a lot of experimentation, and basically, a clogged filter is no fun.
No,
and they clog suddenly.
I've had some like 16-hour filtration days on commercial batches when I was young and stupid and screwed stuff up to no end. I got really good at it and got it down to like under 2 hours. But yeah, clog filter, you just, with the homebrew thing, it's such a low cost compared to a commercial filter that if you clog it by accident, or, you know, you dip the tube into the sediment too far and it clogs it, you just rip the pads out and put in new pads. You know, it's, you probably want to avoid that in the long term, but you know, with the mini jet, the filter pads aren't that expensive. So, yeah. So anyways, if you're going to really be making sake and you're super into it, I thoroughly recommend getting a mini jet filter, just to be able to put it way down into the filtration range. And then you can keg it and enjoy sake for months, you know.
It's a good recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. If you were going to buy a filter for the club, like if you were going to buy one filter for everybody, you'd buy the super jet. You wouldn't buy this mini jet thing. The super jet's like, I forget how much, $300, $350 maybe. But you could do much larger batches, but also you'll just get better filtration, repeatability, and it will last a lot longer than the plastic housing mini jet. So, some final thoughts. Again, with the don't use CO2, please. It really changes the taste of your sake so fast. You can, in a keg, carbonate sake much like you would any other product. So you could jack it under pressure and shake it and do all that. And you could carbonate sake and it would then push with CO2 would be fine. But if you want to be making still sake, something you might want to serve warmer or just to emulate kind of, you know, colder sakes that you would buy commercially, no CO2. So nitrogen only. And then you would push a still sake with nitrogen. You would not use beer gas, which is 75 nitrogen, 25 CO2. You'll still taste it. So when I actually started the brewery, I sold kegs of sake to people. So before I did that, I set up an experiment where I had a 4-tap jockey box connected to 4 different kegs, all pushed with different stuff. And then let them sit there for a couple days like you would in a kegerator. And anything with CO2 in it was unfortunately sort of tainted, you know, carbonic acid and CO2. And it just, I don't know, it doesn't taste great. So, but I encourage you, if you have a sake that's kind of nice and you want to carbonate it, you can do that. But everything else, nitrogen. And then one of the things I do with sake that I make is I try it at like every temperature, because you know, you don't know. Well, you guys don't know. You don't know what's going to taste good at what temperature. So you might brew a batch, and you might try it cold and go, it's okay. And you might try it at 30 degrees centigrade, and it's amazing. I've had that happen to me. So it's totally possible. So I would recommend like on the rocks first, and then just from the fridge, and then room temp. And then the classic Japanese temperatures are 30, 40, 50, and 60. You can go 70. It's usually not really in my liking. And then there's a separate really nerdy temperature where you go to 70 and let it cool back down to 50, which is different than 50. So, but I would try heat it up to 30 and then 40, 50, and just to see how your sake tastes at different temps. The way I make sake personally, I don't have a lot of stuff that tastes good at higher temps. My stuff is all cold and on the rocks, but I've definitely had a lot of homebrewed sake that tasted better warmed up, or R&D batches. I've been getting a lot of R&D batches now because I'm helping some breweries open around the country. So I'm doing like remote consulting, and I get R&D batches in the mail, and I do the same thing. I do this exact same thing. I test them on the rocks, and then fridge, room, and then at 4 different hot temps. The hot temps you would do by just putting them in a vessel, some sort of ceramic thing or glass thing, and putting them in water that's been boiled, and then measuring the temp with a thermometer as it warms up in the hot water bath. That's the best way to do it. You can microwave it. There's some people microwave hot sake. Every Japanese microwave has a hot sake button, much like we have a popcorn.
Really?
Chef Mike.
Yeah, it's
What characteristics of a sake might make it better at a high temperature?
for me personally, I like sake that has a lower acid and more ricey and kind of earthy character. I feel like those are great warmed up. Sake that's real delicate and fruity and really pops out at you, those are great cold, and that's kind of what the target of a modern brewer is going for. In Japan, here it's a different thing. I tell everybody to drink their sake cold. Because that's 90-something% of all the sake. In Japan, where there's much greater variety, we would go and buy sake that was specifically brewed to be warmed up. And so a lot of it has higher aminos, lower acid, and higher alcohol, and more kind of rice and earth character. Earthy, I mean, like, that's a whole family of flavors, like nutty and, nutty and grainy. And obviously you're making something out of rice. You can actually get stuff that tastes like rice. But yeah, stuff along that way. The fruitier stuff, I don't think tastes as good heated up. But there's going to be some variability with you guys. So that's why I said you don't know. I would totally try your sake at every time. You might not like hot sake, and then find you brew something that tastes really good hot. So, yeah.
Do you ever use charcoal to filtering?
I don't. I don't really like it. So charcoal filtering became super popular in Japan in the early, kind of 90s and 2000s, early 2000s and the 90s. Japanese people like stuff that's like pure looking. And so charcoal filter, so sake actually has color to it. People think about it like a clear beverage, but sake, when you look at it in larger quantities, like in a carboy, will have a yellowish kind of gold cast to it. Depends on the rice you use, depends on your water chemistry. There used to be a big trend. It's still around, but it's not as hot as it was. As people would use charcoal filtration, and so the sake would come out literally looking like water, like zero color. And so the problem with charcoal filtration is it removes color, and it removes some undesirable things. But if you're not careful, it also removes desirable things. But for a brewery in Japan, like a commercial brewery, that's a trade-off that they're willing to make. And so they control the rate of contact with the charcoal. And so what they do is they actually mix powdered charcoal into a tank of sake. So the whole tank turns black, and then they filter that all out using a filter. And so they have some kind of, every brewery does it differently. Sometimes there's a dude literally with a stopwatch, and the head brewer will taste the sake and go, oh yeah, you need to use the number 8 grit charcoal at 40 minutes with blah, blah, blah. Like, you know what I mean? It's one of those things. And so I don't like that it takes out some stuff that's desirable as well as color. And I don't mind that the color's in there. So I'd rather taste the sort of true expression of the sake than to remove some flavor and aroma just for the sake of color. Right. That's my thought on it. But
I tried it once, and a really rich flavored batch turned into something just like call it inexpensive commercial sake.
Right. It just stripped it right out. Yeah.
Yep.
And so to do it right, you would have to do it. I experimented with it on a commercial level, and the sake was okay. I just didn't like the sake as much as pre-filter. But what I did was I used a plate and frame filter, which is just like that homebrew filter. It has like sheets in it. And I bought sheets that were impregnated with carbon, activated carbon. And I used every other sheet was carbon. So I wasn't putting it through all carbon, but I interspersed them in the filter. It was okay, but it wasn't as good as the sake pre-filter. It took too much stuff out for me personally. Yeah. You'll see it. Sometimes you'll get a commercial sake and you'll pour it in a glass, and it's like, it's weird. It's like it's such a lack of color that it almost looks like a color. It's like so clear, it looks like it's glowing. It's real weird. And that's a charcoal filtered sake. There aren't many in this area that I've encountered. But yeah, but most commercial sake is sterile filtered, without a doubt. Most commercial sake is sterile filtered and pasteurized twice. So pasteurized once, so filtered and all that, pasteurized once, aged in a tank for 6 months, put in a bottle, pasteurized again in the bottle. And that way it's like bomb proof and can sit on a shelf in Oklahoma somewhere or whatever, you know. My sake is fridge only. Even in my next brewery, I'm going to say that accounts and restaurants, everybody has to keep it cold.
Well, it certainly tastes, but I've had far too much store sake that's been abused.
Mm-hmm.
And
an awful lot of it.
Yeah, and the clear bottles that Japanese sake comes in,
yeah,
the stuff is horribly light sensitive.
It is. Yeah, I mean, you're okay in a carboy in a fridge or something, but yeah, I wouldn't package sake in a clear glass bottle or frosted glass or whatever. Yeah. I mean, that stuff usually is charcoal filtered and pasteurized twice. Like, it has a little bit of shelf life, but you're right, it's light sensitive and the color changes. And then I think once the color changes, it's unappealing to the consumer. And then they don't want to buy it. I've seen some clear bottled sakes with like some brownish sake in it. That's why when I redid the sake selection for the Dion stores, I told them to go with cups and cans. So some of the cups are clearish and have like painted designs on them, but the stuff moves so quickly it's not hanging around. So cans are great, obviously, no light. And canned beverages have a lower dissolved oxygen rate than bottled beverages. Just, you know, that goes with beer too. But yeah, the glass cups that they come in, some of them are clear, but they crank through them so fast that it doesn't really matter. And they're not all in the fridge. They come in a cardboard box, so the remainder that's not in the fridge is in a cardboard box. So yeah, works out. Have you guys ever seen those? I don't have one in front of me, but the cup sake.
Cup, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
We
They're
got
just
them.
like glass cups with like a metal lid on top.
Yep. We had the Bambi one. We heated up to 100.
Oh yeah, the Bambi cup. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So
The Panda cup.
So a Panda cup. Yeah, that's the king of the heat. Oh yeah, Amabuki. See, they're like a clear glass cup, but they crank through those so fast, and they sit in a cardboard box that they don't get light struck. And that's why I switched them all to that. You can find some nice sake that comes in a big bottle in the Boston area, but it's like 5 years old and tastes like crap. And so I'd much rather have people buy something small that they're just like cranking through. That's the whole game.
Check your dates.
Hmm?
Check your dates, right?
I don't want beer that's old either, you know?
So I've seen a sake that was in a paper carton, like a milk carton. Do you?
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but do you know about that?
Pretty good, actually. I think in the Boston area you can now buy Namahage. No, that's not Namahage. It's there's two sakes with the same name. There's some brands in Japan. There's double brands because we're in sake for a long time. But there's an oni. There's a thing that has like a demon on it, and it's a juice box. It's literally like a juice box with a little straw on the side, just like you give your kids, full of sake. So in Japan and other countries, we don't seem to have the same preconceived notion about packaging. Much like the argument with screw caps versus corks on wine, screw caps are superior in every way, shape, or form that I care about. Scientifically, they're better. They're cheaper, they're easier to apply, they provide a better oxygen barrier, but there's still wineries that use corks, you know, because it's like a romantic thing. And so sake comes in cans and cups and Tetra packs, which is like a milk carton basically. Comes in a Tetra pack with a little cap on the top. Juice boxes. I've seen all kinds of manners of, different packaging. Oh, they come in, not here, but in Japan, you can get paper cups that are sealed like a bubble tea, like the cellophane seal on top. So it's like a temporary packaging thing that breweries will do for like grab and go. And so you can go to a brewery in Japan and they just have like a paper cup of sake with a seal on top, and you'll take it to go. Obviously, they're not doing those, months at a time or whatever. They're doing them, probably a couple days in advance, but that's it. But yeah, sake comes in all kinds of different forms. There's actually some sake at Reliable Market. Not that I work for Reliable Market. I've said their name a lot, but there's some sake there in a Tetra Pak. It's like a big square Tetra Pak with Japanese writing on it. And some of that sake is actually pretty good. It's actually not that bad. Oh, Miss Lee gave us a thumbs up. Reliable Market.
She lives about 2 blocks away.
They're the best people. They're such nice people.
Yeah.
And they always pay their bill on time. They're great people. And so they have a nice sake selection there. I would buy only the sake that's in the fridge. There's some stuff that's been on the shelf for a while at Reliable Market. But
they got a lot in the fridge.
Yeah, they have a lot in the fridge. They're like 4 fridge doors full of sake. So they do have that big, fat Tetra Pak, look like a milk carton of sake. It's actually not bad sake. It's better than, getting a big bottle of Gekekon or something made in California. Yeah, it's actually pretty decent. I'll drink anything, really. I like sake. Sometimes I buy the cheap Gekekon, and I mostly use it for making cocktails.
Okay, mix it up.
With no liquor, just sake. So I'll take a glass like this, and I'll put ice in here, and then I'll put like 4 to 5 ounces of sake, which is a serving. And then I'll put like a little bit of like green tea simple syrup and some, lime, and that's a cocktail, without liquor, which is pretty cool. So I'll use cheap sake for something like that. Generally I just drink good sake.
Do you think a pre-mixed packaged sake cocktail like that would do well on the market? And I'm also thinking about kind of a sake-based competitor to maybe some of the hard seltzers that are out there.
Yeah, so the sake-based hard seltzer thing is coming. That's actually one of my consultant jobs. So one of my consultant jobs is starting a new brewery in the South, sake brewery. These people are building a pretty big sake brewery, but they're going to make a filtered sake and an unfiltered sake in cans, but their focus is going to be a sake-based seltzer. They're calling it sparkling sake, but I keep calling it sake seltzer because that's what it is. They're brewing like a 19 to 20% ABV sake and then watering it down to 6 and adding flavoring and carbonating. So they're basically making like a high-end White Claw or whatever. It's actually pretty good, but if anybody wants to do that experiment, I've done it 1,000 times. You get cheap sake in the store or like regular sake, it doesn't matter. And then you use a soda stream, that thing that carbonates soda water on your counter. So you put some sake in there and then some water and then you carbonate it. It's pretty good. I do sake water, a splash of maple syrup, and then I carbonate it. And it's really good. It's like a lightly maple flavored sake seltzer beverage. If you go on Google and type in alcohol dilution calculator, not a thing that usually comes up in homebrewing, you can actually get a pretty tight figure for, I have 15% ABV sake, like commercial sake. I want to make a liter at 6%. It'll tell you how much to use. So you can dilute it down to 6 and, not have it be complete guesswork. So yeah. So I hope it works out. I mean, the consulting job I'm doing is kind of interesting, helping them get the brewery up and going. And then if it wasn't for coronavirus, I would be down there now. But the seltzer thing is kind of a new thing, but it's interesting to work on. It's not really my thing, but it tastes okay. Yeah.
In your new brewery, are you going to do any brewer's liquid added to it?
Oh, like a honjozo where you add alcohol to sake?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Okay.
It's kind of funny. So there's 2 kinds of sake. If people don't know this, there's 2 kinds of sake brewing methods, basically. One is called Junmai, which is what you're all making. That's a higher level of sake in Japan, believe it or not. It's the original sake, so you don't, it's just rice and water and koji and yeast, and that's it. Jun means pure, and mai means rice, so like pure rice expression. Honjozo, which means real brewed, oddly enough, is a sake where they go to, let's say 16 or 17% alcohol, and then they add a bit of distilled brewer's yeast, which is like, brewer's alcohol, which is like a neutral alcohol with no flavor, no color, no nothing. And that jacks the ABV from like 17 to 19 or 20. It halts the yeast, and then people who do it really well seem to think that it traps alcohol-soluble flavors and aromas that you would lose normally during pressing. I think that just sounds like a bunch of crap, but they do it. It makes a very different sake, but they're not fortifying it because they eventually water that back down to 15 or 16. So they're adding alcohol temporarily and then backing that off. It makes a simpler, kind of more rounded off flavor profile. You don't get, so the fresh sake that you guys are gonna make and sake like I make, like it's got flavors and aromas that kind of jump out at you because it's real fresh. And so a Honjozo sake just kind of rounds all that off. So it's a more sort of muted expression, but a more like rounded off. And if you're making something like mass-produced sake or table sake or something, it makes a lot of sense. There are delicious Honjozo sakes. I believe, hold on. Oh, they changed the can to English. They threw me. But this is a Honjozo sake, the Perfect Snow. All the Kikasui cans, which are super delicious, are Honjozo. They're really good at it. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I like to say it's analogous to corn or rice in a beer, right? I could make you an amazing corn or rice beer, but all of shit beer is also corn and rice beer, right? So it's kind of the same thing. You alcohol added sake, I could make you a delicious Honjozo sake, but all of the cheap crap sake is alcohol added sake. So, so yeah, it's interesting. But in the United States, the TTB does not allow me to add a distilled alcoholic beverage to an alcoholic beverage. So just like I couldn't pour a bottle of bourbon in a beer, right? People get in trouble for that every now and again. But they usually scapegoat somebody every couple of years. But yeah, so we can't do that in the US. So we're stuck with making high-end sake. So I'm good with that. I've tried it at home. It's okay. Most brewers in Japan, believe it or not, little trade secret, use kishasha, which is like a Brazilian sugarcane spirit. So they buy an unaged kishasha, which is like sugarcane that's been fermented and distilled, no barrel aging, no nothing. It looks like clear water and, you know, has no flavor, no aroma, no nothing. And so a lot of Japanese breweries actually do that because there's a lot of trade between Japan and Brazil. And there's a large history of Japanese people living in Brazil and vice versa. So yeah, that's what they use. Pretty cool. You could try it if you want to. It's pretty cool.
No, that's a good answer. Yeah, it's a pretty deep dive.
Yeah, sorry. I'm all
no, it's great.
Yeah, we're learning a lot. Thank you.
I was gonna say that's where I live. But yeah, it's I never felt the need to do it. It just, you know, if you were going to do anything as like a step 2, like you've brewed a bunch of batches of sake, it's really interesting, you could look into making the stuff where you make a 1-month yeast starter and grow your own lactic acid. You could do something like that, and that would make a cool sake that would taste probably better warmed because it would make like earthier, sort of more savory sake. But you could contact me then if you really want to do it, or look it up online. So you're basically doing like a 2-week just rice and water. That's it. Rice, water, no lactic acid, nothing. And lactobacillus takes over. And you're basically pickling rice, for lack of a better term. So you do a 2-week period where lactobacillus grows in there. The thing acidifies, becomes kind of funky, and then starts to clear up towards the end. And then after week 2, you put in the yeast, and then you spend the next 2 weeks propagating the yeast in your newly acidified rice liquid. And then when that whole month is over, you take that little tiny batch of sake and you dump it in the tank and you start building a batch on top of it, just like I detailed in this PowerPoint. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's pretty cool, but that's a whole different thing. I'm gonna close this out. I don't
Yep.
know. You guys,
Yeah.
I don't even know what you're looking at now. Zoom.
Whatever. Yeah. No, it's all good.
Oh, there's all our faces.
Yeah. Sorry, I was sharing. I was co-opting the thing, but yeah. So I mean,
yeah, appreciate it. That's
Yeah,
a
no
great
problem.
presentation.
Thanks.
We learned a ton.
Does anybody have any questions?
Besides,
I got
anybody
one.
else?
I
Yeah,
got
go
one.
ahead. Oh, Pete.
Just about like one of the things that in beer brewing where I know we'll reuse yeast.
Mhm.
Is there reuse? And I'm kind of intrigued about the growing sake, growing koji. You know, and you said you could go like a whole nother 25 hours talking about that. And but could you just touch on it a little bit, or is it once you start down there?
Yeah,
And
without a doubt. So there is no reusing yeast.
Okay.
Fermentation generally doesn't crop its yeast, but also there's a lot going on in sake, right? So you've got the yeast fermentation, you got the koji thing. It's really hard to separate out the yeast. You could probably do it on a very large commercial scale with centrifuges and stuff like that, but people in Japan don't even do it. It's just too much of a trouble to get the yeast layer from a centrifuged out thing full of rice and whatever, you know. But growing.
And how are they propagating their yeast?
So pretty interesting. There's kind of a mafia situation going on. So in Japan, there are very few private companies like White Labs or somebody like that. There's a couple, and they're labs, but the Brewers Association of Japan controls all of the official sake yeast strains. There are many private local yeast strains, but all of the official ones are controlled by the Japanese Brewing Association. And so you have to order yeast from them, and you get like tiny ampules of yeast, like little glass 10 milliliter ampules. And then everyone will open those, prop those up in like a 3 or 4 liter Erlenmeyer flask with some glucose water. And then that gets dumped into a yeast starter to start a batch of sake. You guys don't have to do that because you can just buy yeast from White Labs. And actually, I do the same thing. So I don't make, so a 1 month yeast starter was like the funkier natural sake, the original sake. A modern yeast starter, you add the lactic acid, but you're still making a 10-day yeast starter because in Japan, they have to prop up these little tiny things of yeast. What I do is I order 1.5 liter things of yeast from White Labs, and I dump that in the tank, and the thing takes off like a rocket. So basically, they're doing the yeast starter for me, and that is something that's done in Japan, but it's pretty rare. There's that term for it and everything. I thought I was being unique, but turns out I wasn't. So, but it makes delicious sake. It's just that they don't really have that infrastructure like we have here. So I could order, an infinite supply of yeast from White Labs. So I don't have to make a yeast starter unless I'm making those previously mentioned historic styles. But Pete was asking about koji. Koji is a 48 to 52 hour process where you propagate spores of koji on rice. So generally what you're trying to do, in a simplistic way of describing it, is you process the rice in the same way you would for brewing. You soak it, wash it, soak it, steam it, cool it down a little bit, and then you would put it in a sterile environment, in, I don't know, trays or whatever, and then you would propagate a spore on it, and then you would put the thing through like a pretty detailed temperature gradient over 48 to 52 hours. It's warm. So the beginning 22 hours is at 30 degrees centigrade. And that just allows the koji spores to start growing on the rice. And then you would quickly want to jump that up to 35 degrees centigrade, which is like 120-ish Fahrenheit, just to give you some indication. So now you've got this thing like warm and moist because you're growing fungus. And then the koji would start to grow more and more and then create a lot of heat. So during the process, you actually have to take the koji out and stir it a lot because it'll create enough heat that it'll kill itself. And then after that kind of middle period, the last 10 to 12 hours of the 48 to 52 hour growing process, the koji is between 40 and 42 degrees centigrade, which is pretty damn hot. And so you have to stir it constantly. But also what you're trying to do is the genetic material in the fungus plant, we'll call it a plant, but the fungus, the genetic material for the enzymes that it creates when you mix it with water that allow it to break down rice into sugar, so chiefly alpha amylase enzymes, are created by genetic material in the root structure of the koji. And so what you're trying to do during this process is you propagate it in the beginning, and then as the koji grows, you're mixing it and drying out the koji so that if this is like a macro view of a rice grain, you keep it wet for the first day and the koji propagates on the outside. And then as you grow the koji, it gets hotter and hotter, you're drying it out. So the moisture goes to the middle of the rice and the plant has to chase the moisture to the center of each grain. And that creates more root structure, which creates more genetic material for enzymatic production during fermentation. So there's people who do it in a home. I mean, I used to do it. I had an incubator that I kind of borrowed from Sam Adams in 2008. I still have it, but I borrowed it in 2008.
That was coming.
Yeah, it was a metal like laboratory incubator that no one had used since the 80s, and I liberated it. But yeah, there's people who do it in like coolers. I mean, 42 degrees centigrade is pretty hot. So you've got to be able to keep this stuff fairly warm. And so there's all kinds of books about growing koji. There's actually, probably the best one is about growing koji for food. Hold on, I got it right here. So this isn't bad. If you want to go offline. I mean, the internet obviously has a lot of shit about growing koji, but the Book of Miso by, I don't know, William Shirtleff and his Japanese wife, has a pretty big section on the back about growing koji specifically at home. So it talks about coolers, and they use blankets and stuff to keep it warm. So something like this is a pretty good way to go. I'm trying to find the actual. This is from the 70s or 80s, so no color photographs. Don't expect that. What the hell is that section? Sorry, I'm flipping through. So yeah, there's stuff in here about making koji at home. Yeah, they just use like some wooden trays and like a cooler box, like an insulated cooler box, and blankets and stuff. And so this is about this is pretty good. So not bad. You gotta understand that I've never really researched making koji at home. So I guarantee you there's a couple of things on the internet, I'm probably sure. But I do it inside a laboratory incubator, inside 9x13 brownie pans, like on each shelf. But there's a lot of different ways that I'm sure people have, because a lot of chefs grow koji. And so there's actually some pretty cool information about chefs growing small amounts of koji in kitchens and stuff. There's some pretty cool stuff online for that. But it's not anything that I've really tried to do that much.
I guess my next question after that would be is how much does that affect your flavor? Like if you're growing your own stuff, is that?
Yeah. Koji is the most important thing in sake making. So if you can grow good koji, your sake will be way better. It's the #1 thing you could do to make your sake better, besides using a good yeast. much like beer, obviously, a lot of all the flavor and aroma comes from yeast. But the danger with sake, so you've got two microbiological processes going on at the same time. You've got koji creating enzymes to convert rice into sugar, and you've got yeast eating the sugar, making alcohol and carbon dioxide and flavors and aromas and all those chemicals. So it's the balance of those two processes that makes good sake. So the danger is if you have bad koji and good yeast, then the koji doesn't create a lot of sugar, and then the yeast runs out of food and creates autolysis, like off flavors from yeast dying. And then if you have great koji but crappy yeast, then you're creating a ton of sugar and the yeast can't keep up, and now you just have a giant tank full of food, which, you know, lots of microorganisms around that would love a giant tank full of food. So that's kind of the balance and some of the mistakes that people make. And so the homebrew stuff that I made early on before I made my own koji, with Cold Mountain koji or koji I bought in like an Asian market in the refrigerator, actually came out fairly decent. Like, it's a great place to start. It makes drinkable, fairly good sake. As you want to up your game, you could certainly go down a giant rabbit hole about growing koji and grow your own koji. You could try to get better and better rice. I'm not really sure. You can buy basically the best rice in the world for making sake in North America. Well, I can buy it. So I'm not sure on a homebrew scale. I'm not sure how much you could buy or what it would cost. But you could get it from Minneapolis. Minnesota Rice and Milling. You could buy it from them, but I'm not sure. Might have to buy, I don't know, 4 50-pound bags or something. I have no idea.
Yeah, you said those machines cost $1 million, right? Those polishing machines?
Oh, minimum. Yeah, I looked at a used one that was $925. So used. So yeah, they're expensive. Rice mills are expensive. So there's one in Minneapolis, which is the closest one to us. The rice is grown in Arkansas. Yamada Nishiki is the name of the rice, and it's the king of all sake brewing rices in Japan. And so I use a lot of that. And it's grown in Arkansas, milled in Minneapolis, and then shipped to Boston. And that's as small as I could make the circle. So the only other place to buy sake brewing rice is California. Yeah. Cool. So you could, if Minnesota Rice and Milling had too high of a like order amount or whatever, I'm sure you could call Valley Select is the name of the company. Valley Select also has Yamada Nishiki rice, and they sell it in 50-pound bags. So they would definitely sell you some Yamada Nishiki rice if you wanted to kind of up your sake game.
Last stupid question.
No stupid question.
Why do you separate the processes? Why couldn't you just throw koji, let it do its thing with the rice, and then add the yeast later? Why do you add them all at the same time?
During brewing?
Yeah, like I'm just saying, like Doug and I had this conversation about they had a koji malting plant, and they used it for barley, and they actually malted the barley with koji. You know, so why couldn't you do the same thing with rice and just let it convert the sugars first, and then go into and add the yeast afterward and separate the process?
So there's two things. One, you'd be in the aforementioned giant tank full of food category. So you'd get it'd just be a giant tank full of sugar water. It'd be hard to keep aseptic, especially 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I mean, sake brewing's been going on for thousands of years, right? So, so there's that, but also sake yeast seems to really function well when you give it like a little packet of sugar and then you create another one. You know what I mean? Like that balance of creating sugar and fermenting sugar creates really interesting, complex sakes. And so I've never actually tried it, but I'm sure you could liquefy a thing of rice and water with alpha amylase enzyme from a vial, and then throw yeast in it and ferment it, but I don't think you would get any of the complexity. You just get alcohol, basically. You know?
The koji yeast is secreting those enzymes ultimately for its own benefit. So if all you had was koji mold in there, it's going to eat those sugars itself and grow more koji mold instead of making tasty sake.
Right. Yeah, there's processes that are going on with the koji too, right? So koji's doing its own thing, but there's certainly flavor elements from koji that you wouldn't get otherwise that happen over time. Cheap sake, like Gekkeikan, not to throw them under the bus, but Gekkeikan is the largest sake brewer in the world. They have a brewery in California. Awesome head brewer, cool guy. But they have a really different way of making sake. So they grind the rice into grits and then pump it from building A to building B through a pipe using high pressure steam. And then the high pressure steam actually not only pushes the rice from building A to building B, but it cooks it along the way because it's all grind into like sand. And then they add alpha amylase enzymes from a lab and yeast and lactic acid, but they add some koji for flavor to make it taste a little more like sake. And then blend all that together and process it out the way.
Speaking of weird shortcuts, what if we boiled the rice instead of steaming it?
Yeah, it doesn't work very well. So one of the tricks of sake is you're dissolving the rice from the outside in, which slows down the process a little bit and allows the yeast to create a lot of interesting flavors. If you boil, so rice grains are actually made of two kinds of starches, amylose and amylopectin. The best way to describe that is amylopectin are like steel beams in a building, and amylose is like the concrete in a building. So what you're going to do is dissolve the concrete out, and you're still going to have the steel frame of the building untouched. And so what you would do with boiling is you would break a lot of those bonds, and you would end up having a lot of amylopectin in there, which you do not really want. It doesn't ferment very well. It doesn't taste very good. And so that's why you'll see when you ferment a batch of sake, there's things in there that look like whole bits of rice. And you might think, hey, didn't I convert this rice into sugar and ferment it? And really what you did was you dissolve the starch out of the rice grain, but there's enough amylopectin in a grain of rice that it still holds its shape after you've dissolved a lot of the starch out of it and made sugar. So if by boiling it, you'd break all that apart, it just like completely explodes the rice. Also, you want to dissolve each grain of rice, so steaming it keeps all the rice grains real separate. So they have like a hard outside that the koji can attach to. It doesn't work very well if you boil rice. Did that answer your question?
Yep, thanks.
Oh, interesting side note, risotto rice, arborio rice from Italy, can also make sake, but it has a slightly higher amylopectin content. So you get less extract from the rice, and so you get a little less sake, but it still makes pretty tasty sake. So when you make risotto, you do this very careful process where you suck out all the starch and make a creamy sauce, but the rice holds its shape. And the Italians bred specific rice, so it holds its shape like that after cooking for a long time, and that's high amylopectin. Yep.
I wanted to ask if rice is the only ingredient, because when I make rice, I put in different types of rice.
Oh
like
yeah,
polished and
like,
unmilled,
yeah.
and then other grains to be like more nutritionally like diverse.
Yeah, there's millet and barley in there and all kinds of stuff. Do you buy that like 10 grain mix at the store?
No, I make my own mix.
Oh, cool. Whoa.
Yeah.
I buy it. Sorry. Mine's got like beans in it. Mine's got I buy a Japanese one. It's got like beans and sesame seeds and all that. Some of that stuff, I probably wouldn't put beans in it, but some of that stuff would break down and would create a fairly unique flavor.
Oh.
I've never tried it. I don't think I'd put sesame seeds in there or beans or some of that stuff. But so the other thing you got to remember is the technology that we're talking about with converting rice into sugar using koji is not unique to sake. It's fairly unique to Asia, but it's not unique to sake. So they make soy sauce that way, miso, and all that. The difference is the koji variety that we use to make sake is called yellow koji, and it creates a lot of alpha amylase, which is the enzyme that breaks carbohydrates into starches into sugar. However, there's also protease, which breaks down protein, and lipase, which breaks down fats. And so you can get koji of different varieties that create more protease and more lipase and less alpha amylase. And those things are great for converting beans and grains and heavier things, barley and stuff. And so when they make shochu, which is a Japanese distilled spirit, in Korean it's called soju, although soju has become a very different thing in the modern world. So, but traditional soju is, they use a white koji or black koji, and they convert heavier grains like barley and sweet potatoes and things like that, and then ferment that and then distill it into a distilled beverage. And then with miso, there's no real alcohol production that goes on, very little, but they're breaking down beans, a ton of soybeans, using different kinds of koji. So I don't know. So anyways, so the koji would create a little bit of lipase and protease, but not enough to break down beans and sesame seeds and whatnot. But if you make your own mix and it's just grains, you can try it. I think a good way to experiment with that would be to make a regular batch of sake, and then 36 hours before you press it, you would dump some of your grain mix in there. Well, you have to cook it. So you'd steam that grain mix, dump it in there, leave it for 24 to 36 hours, and then press it. And so what you would get in that regard is you would get sugars that wouldn't ferment out, and you'd get flavor that wouldn't ferment out, that you could leave in the beverage. I've done some experimenting like that. I made a black rice sake. But when I talked about water chemistry, I said iron was really bad. So black rice and Tibetan red rice and some colored rices have real high iron. So you don't want to make a sake batch with 100% black rice. However, I made a regular batch of sake, dried it out, and then added a bunch of black rice right before pressing, and it made like a purple nigori that had the purple rice or black rice character to it, which didn't ferment out and provided some sweetness.
And it tasted more complex?
Oh yeah, it was pretty awesome. It's kind of like, almost like a beer idea. Not many Japanese brewers think this way, because I've had this conversation about a million times in Japan, but I tend to think, I come from the beer world, so I tend to think, well, I could make a regular batch of sake and then kind of top note something on there, right? So a day before pressing, you could add jasmine rice, and that flavor would stay in there because it wouldn't be fermented away. It would start to break down the jasmine rice into sugar, and you get the flavor of it, and that would be it. You wouldn't ferment that away. Yeah.
If Ramsey were online, and he's not, but I would suggest like the smoked jasmine rice.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, there's a tea smoked rice out there. Basmati rice would be really interesting. I thought about making an ancient grain sake, where I would like make a sake and then add like amaranth and quinoa and teff and all these like weird ancient grains. I got a long list in my notebook of things to try that I just haven't got around to it.
All right. So yeah, Todd, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
2 hours. Jeez.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, so like I said, I will give that PowerPoint to Doug, and Doug can disseminate it to everybody.
Cheers. Right.
Oh,
Thank you.
awesome. It was good to talk to you all, guys. Obviously, if you have any questions, reach out.
Get ready to try some bad sake.
Yeah,
We're gonna send it your way.
All right.
I was gonna say chomping at the bit to try some homebrew sake. So I've actually had some pretty good homebrew. I've had some homebrew sake that was better than some commercial sake. So it's definitely possible. There's also some real bad commercial
What
sake.
do you think about the impact of having a standard brew house where you might be brewing Brett beers and other things, and then you've got an open fermentation in the same spot?
Yeah, I'd keep that pretty separate.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's also koji can go airborne a little bit. It's not koji's not going to ruin a beer because you boil it, but there's stuff that goes airborne for sure. Sake yeast goes airborne, and remember, sake yeast is cold loving. So you might, if you get an infection of sake yeast in one of your beers and you crash cool it, and you're like, this will arrest fermentation, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, this is bubbling away like nothing's going on. So I'd probably keep all that pretty separate.
If you grow your own koji, your rice, if you cook rice and leave it around, it will turn green.
Oh, yeah, if you grow koji and don't stop it.
Well, just having done it in the, done it, taken it out, used it, cleaned everything up. 2 months later, cook some rice, leave it out, turns color.
Yeah, if you let koji propagate, like if you let koji go all the way past the like 48 to 52 hours, it will start to reproduce like anything else. So you could actually, I've had some people do that when they're like, oh, I can buy 100 grams of koji spores and then grow my own spores. I never got into that, but yeah, if you let it go far enough, it'll propagate. And if you don't fully clean it up, obviously it'll come back. Yeah.
It's an interesting flavor to the. One question about koji. I read about all sorts of different strains of koji in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Are any of them available in the U.S. beyond the one I know of?
When I was a home brewer, I ordered stuff from a website called Gem Cultures, GEM. They're in California. I'm looking them up right now. Oh, they still exist. Shitty website, but Gem Cultures, you can buy koji from them. If you call them on the phone, you probably get a little bit of better whatever customer response or whatever. But yeah, you can get light koji, red koji, barley, soy, shoyu. You want to get light koji from these guys. But yeah, you could call them and just say, I'm brewing sake and I want to know what koji to order.
Yeah, because I read about different varieties of sake, specifically for sake.
Yeah, none of that's really available outside of a commercial application. So the lab that I order from in Japan has like, I don't know, maybe 50 strains of koji, something like that. And so I can fine tune the koji if I wanted a koji that made like more glucose or a shorter growing cycle or whatever. Generally, a small brewery like one that I would build, you want to pick a koji that you really love and just get better and better at growing it. That'll actually make more of an impact on your sake than playing around with all these different koji strains. But there's, some breweries in the U.S., like smaller craft breweries in the U.S., use like 3 or 4 strains of koji, depending on what they want to do. There's some koji out there that are better for unpasteurized sakes, and some make more glucose, and, there's a long list, aroma compounds are created and all those other stuff. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome.
All right, sweet. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Good to talk to you guys. Go make
Yeah.
some
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Right. I think
Thanks a lot.
I might get a call from Reliable Market tomorrow that people bought 400 pounds of rice.
Maybe.
I'm sure.
Thank you, Todd.
Thanks a lot.
Cool. All right.
Bye.
Well, good luck. Just reach out to me if there's any questions. You can get in touch with me either through bostonsake.com or fartheststarsake.com. So feel free to reach out with questions anytime you want.
Yeah, it's been great.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Awesome. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Have a good night.
Yep, thank you.
It's going to take me 10 minutes to walk.
I switched over to any IPA.
Oh, nice. I drank some of those earlier. I had a Focal Banger and something else earlier.
Nice.
Focal Banger and a Danko from Exhibit A,
Oh,
which is their rye IPA. Pretty good. All right, I'm gonna go have a beer. See you guys later.
cheers.
Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Cheers.
Appreciate it.